call came just before midnight. Don't launch, it's not safe. But the warning never reached the astronauts. A quiet override swept through the control rooms. Engineers protested. Executives overruled. The next morning, Challenger soared into the sky, its fate already sealed by a decision made in silence. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was sabotage by silence. And the truth is still buried. At the heart of NASA's ambition stood Challenger, a vessel of dreams, media spotlight, and national pride. This was no ordinary mission. It carried a civilian teacher, Krista McAuliffe, set to become the first educator in space. The world was watching. Schools were tuning in. Politicians had their eyes on the countdown. But beneath the polished press releases and televised optimism, a quiet war was unfolding. On the ground, at Morton Thiokol engineering headquarters in Utah, a team of specialists monitored a problem that had haunted them for months: the O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters. They knew these seals were vulnerable in cold temperatures, and the Florida forecast showed record lows. Ice clung to the launch pad railings. The shuttle had never launched under such conditions. A teleconference was held. Engineers presented charts, past data, simulations. They urged delay. But at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, pressure was mounting. Delays were stacking. Public patience was thinning. The agency couldn't afford another slip, not with a televised lesson plan in place and a presidential address around the corner. The final go, no-go rested with management. The result? Silence from mission control. Then quietly, a green light. Challenger would launch. Assets deployed. Launch vehicle, Space Shuttle Challenger, OV-099. Mission payload, TDRS-B, satellite and inertial upper stage crew. 7 astronauts command chain, NASA HQ, Marshall Center, Morton Thiokol. The objective was no longer just a launch. It was to preserve appearance, at any cost. There was no enemy radar to evade, no hostile territory to infiltrate. But deception still played a central role in this mission. The enemy wasn't foreign. It was internal. And the battlefield was bureaucratic. NASA didn't need to suppress the truth from the public. They needed to suppress it from within. The strategy? Redefine risk as acceptable noise. Engineers at Morton Thiokol issued their warning on the O-ring seals, urging a launch hold. At 29 degrees Fahrenheit, the rubber's elasticity dropped below safe tolerances. Their concern? The seals wouldn't flex fast enough to contain hot gases from the booster's ignition. They prepared a no-launch recommendation, but the next morning, that recommendation had been reversed. Why? During an off-the-record teleconference, closed to lower-level engineers, Thiokol's senior managers were pressured by NASA's Marshall Center to reconsider their position. The shift didn't happen through consensus. It happened through isolation. The lead engineer, Roger Boisjoli, was silenced. His slides never made it to mission control. The official launch paperwork bore no dissent. The launch readiness review was stamped clean. NASA's upper management, under mounting political pressure, kept the mission profile go by excluding technical dissent from the final chain. Externally, everything looked nominal. Internally, the shuttle was now loaded with unacknowledged risk. Mission deception wasn't about lying. It was about omission. And omission in this case was lethal. Everything had to align. Technically, logistically, politically. On paper, it did. The SRBs were stacked. The external tank was fueled. Flight controllers at the Kennedy Space Center read through the final checklist. But every movement was shadowed by ice. Frozen icicles hung from metal scaffolding, even as countdown teams worked the clock. Engineers on site noted unusual frost on the orbiter's aft field joint, exactly where the O-ring would later fail. No one stopped the process. T-hold sequences were normal. The Eastern Test Range confirmed flight corridor clearance. The launch processing system showed green across the board. But what the public couldn't see, and what many inside NASA wouldn't acknowledge, was the quiet override of basic engineering thresholds. The cold soak had already compromised the boosters. The rubber O-rings had hardened overnight. They were never designed for this environment. The shuttle had launched at 53 degrees Fahrenheit before. This was nearly 25 degrees colder. Still, the logistics chain held fast. Fueling completed with no reported anomalies, crew arrived on schedule and boarded without delay. No abort sequence was triggered during final systems check. Mission clocks resumed. Countdown proceeded. Flight Director Jay Green gave the final go. The booster ignition system was armed. 7 astronauts strapped in. Smiles on faces. Gloves over pressure suits. McAuliffe gave a thumbs up to the launch cam. Thousands of classrooms watching. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off Pad 39B. A perfect ascent on the outside. But inside the SRB, something was already bleeding. Challenger cleared the tower cleanly, pushing through the morning sky like a spear through glass. White vapor trails curled behind it. Ground observers saw nothing but power, grace, momentum. Inside the orbiter, systems read, nominal. Voice loops were calm. Capcom announced, "Throttle up, Challenger." Commander Dick Scobie replied, "Roger, go at throttle up." But by then, the first flame had already escaped. Just 0.678 seconds after liftoff, a black puff of smoke spurted from the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint. No alert was triggered. No telemetry flagged it. But the O-ring seal had failed, allowing superheated gas to carve a path through steel. A blowtorch, hidden inside the skin of the shuttle, continued to burn. By T+36 seconds, Challenger encountered high-altitude wind shear. It corrected automatically, but the stress further widened the compromised joint. By T+59 seconds, flame from the booster breached the strut, connecting it to the external fuel tank. A secondary jet of fire ignited. It sliced into the massive orange hydrogen tank. By T+73 seconds, the entire vehicle was compromised. The external tank ruptured. A plume of liquid hydrogen burst outward. Structural integrity failed. To ground control, there was no explosion. Just silence. Then, "Flight, we've had a major malfunction." The shuttle disintegrated at 46,000 feet, moving at Mach 1.92. The crew cabin remained intact for 25,000 more feet before slamming into the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour. A multi-domain launch, air, sea, atmospheric, had become a multi-domain collapse. The mission never reached orbit, but its fallout would ripple through every layer of the American Aerospace Command chain. No enemy aircraft, no missile threats, but this launch was still monitored like a live-fire combat op. At Cape Canaveral, tactical control over airspace during launch was absolute. The Eastern Test Range had already cleared over 1,500 nautical miles for safety. Military and civilian aircraft were rerouted. Range safety officers watched from high-zoom optical platforms, fingers ready on the destruct command, a final override in case of orbital threat. The Challenger climbed into a corridor laced with radar pulses, microwave signals, and dual satellite tracking. Aerial surveillance tracked every phase: speed, pitch, roll, and vehicle health. NASA's WB-57F reconnaissance aircraft captured high-speed footage from above. But even that footage, frame by frame, missed the critical moment of internal failure. At T plus 70 seconds, all data looked nominal. Only one range safety officer at the time, sitting in a hardened control center 30 miles away, noticed something odd in the camera lens. A flicker of flame just beneath the booster's connecting strut. He leaned forward, whispered to a colleague, "That's not supposed to be there." Before he could confirm, it was too late. A blinding burst of light. Fragments spiraled into the stratosphere. Flight paths disappeared from radar. Destruct commands were not needed. The vehicle had already torn itself apart. But air control didn't stand down. Search and rescue teams, on alert near Patrick Air Force Base, launched immediately. In a matter of minutes, Coast Guard cutters, Navy helicopters, and Air Force planes were racing to the debris zone, searching for survivors in a mission no one had planned. The airspace was secure, but the silence inside it would haunt them for years. In traditional operations, this phase involves eliminating radar, SAMs, and electronic interference. But Challenger's greatest threats didn't come from a hostile radar lock. They came from within. The mission's most dangerous defenses were human ones. A chain of command, unwilling to break protocol. A culture that penalized dissent, and a command structure engineered to reward silence. The engineers who knew the truth had no weapons to deploy, only their voices, and one by one, those voices were overruled. Roger Boisjoli had data, simulations, flight history. He issued warning after warning. In a normal combat environment, his intel would have grounded the mission. Instead, he was shut out of the room. Morton Thiokol was pressured to reverse its stance. Its own vice president told to put on his management hat and agree to launch. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, command node in this operation, never relayed the original descent to HQ. It wasn't that no one sounded the alarm, it was that every layer of defense, technical, ethical, procedural, had been systematically disarmed by a chain of risk denial protocols. There was no sabotage in the traditional sense, no foreign agent. But Challenger was launched under the influence of a suppressed reality. If this had been wartime, it would have been called friendly fire. In truth, it was a silent kill, enabled by the system meant to protect it. The mission was airborne. The broadcast, live across the country. Children, parents, and teachers watching in classrooms. America saw a shuttle riding sunlight into the sky, and then a white flash, a cross-shaped burst, two divergent contrails, and silence. But inside the stack, the strike had already happened. At T plus 72.284 seconds, superheated gases, ignited by breach in the right SRB joint, cut through the lower strut. That strut, meant to anchor the booster to the external tank, failed. The booster rotated inward, puncturing the side of the liquid hydrogen tank. What followed was not an explosion in the traditional sense. The term NASA used was rapid vehicle disassembly. In truth, it was total system failure. The orbiter twisted violently in the airstream. Aerodynamic loads, far beyond tolerance, shredded the airframe. Wings tore, tanks burst, boosters broke free. But the crew compartment, it didn't vaporize, it separated whole. A white capsule spinning through open sky, oxygen tanks still intact. Inside, Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, civilian teacher Krista McAuliffe. 3 personal egress air packs were activated. That meant at least some crew survived the initial breakup. The compartment fell for over 2 minutes, 9 miles, before slamming into the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour. No rescue was possible. No beacon was activated. There was no contingency. The primary strike wasn't enemy fire. It wasn't sabotage. It was authorized launch under suppressed warnings and the catastrophic failure of truth under pressure. For 73 seconds, Challenger flew as a vessel of hope. For 165 seconds more, it descended in silence, carrying 7 souls and the weight of a preventable decision. The mission was over in 73 seconds, but the operation had just begun. By the time Challenger's debris hit the ocean, emergency protocols snapped into place. Coast Guard cutters were already in motion. Navy helicopters deployed from Patrick Air Force Base. Civilian fishing boats and cargo ships joined the grid. The Atlantic was transformed into a recovery theater, militarized in all but name. More than 15,000 pieces of wreckage were retrieved. They found suits, helmets, fragments of shuttle tile, even pages from flight manuals barely torn. The ocean floor became a battlefield of memory, combed grid by grid. Then came the most chilling find, the crew cabin, recovered in March, intact but crushed. All 7 bodies were recovered. Some were still strapped into their seats. No public footage, no televised funeral, just quiet military transfers in unmarked vehicles. Behind closed doors, the investigation escalated. Black box data, corrupted, telemetry, incomplete. Physical evidence, damning. The Rogers Commission was formed. Testimony began. Whistleblowers came forward. One by one, the sealed chambers of silence cracked open. Morton Thiokol officials admitted to reversing their recommendation. NASA managers testified under subpoena. This wasn't a fluke. It was an institutional failure. But even as blame was assigned and safety protocols rewritten, the damage was done. The mission had collateral, not just in debris, but in trust. The launch that was meant to unite a nation ended in silence, flames, and wreckage. But its echo didn't fade. It metastasized into boardrooms, investigations, redesigned systems, and the psyche of a spacefaring nation. The Rogers Commission report laid it bare. This wasn't an engineering accident. It was the result of compromised ethics, muted alarms, and an internal culture of obedience over truth. 9 recommendations were issued. Redesign the solid rocket boosters, improve real-time decision protocols, empower engineers, rebuild trust. NASA complied, publicly, structurally, but beneath the reforms, something else remained. A blueprint of failure so complete, it became part of the institution's nervous system. 17 years later, it surfaced again. Columbia, 2003. Different cause, same symptoms. Even now, pieces of Challenger remain buried in sealed silos across Kennedy Space Center. A few surfaced in 2022, accidentally discovered by a documentary crew diving off Florida's coast. NASA confirmed the find, then sealed it again. No memorial was ever built where the O-ring failed. No marker stands at the point where the seal cracked and fate took over. Because the Challenger didn't just break apart in the sky. It broke something deeper, in the belief that knowledge alone can stop catastrophe. And somewhere, in a control room that once greenlit a launch against better judgment, the silence still lingers,